Hi guys, welcome back to In Case of Econ Struggles. Welcome to another Sunday Stata tip. Today I'm going to talk about looping in Stata. Specifically, I'm just going to introduce you to the syntax of loops for each type of loop. The reason this is important is because if you're not sure which word to use with a for each loop, it can be very annoying because Stata is going to tell you an error that the syntax is incorrect. And it's basically a very simple error of which word you're using after the for loop. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to use this auto data again. So let's just read that in. And then our first for loop, let's just jump right into it, is this for each loop. So if I'm going to use a variable list, and we've seen this before in a couple of different videos now, but if I'm going to do for each, what I'm going to do is I'm going to designate a local name, similar to a local macro, which we talked about last Sunday. And then it's going to be a var list. And this is the var list that I want to do. So I'm just going to go like this, and this is going to loop through each of the different variables, so price, miles per gallon, weight, and trunk. It's going to sum each variable, and then it's going to also generate a variable underscore z, which is the z-score, the standardized version of that variable. Now, one thing that's really nice, if I just go back and reread in this data, because it's a var list, if I'm using price, miles per gallon, weight, and trunk, and say these are in a row, I could do something like price dash trunk, and that would also be a variable list. I could do other sorts of variable lists in here. I could also do locals and globals if I have a list of variables stored in that. But the basic idea is if you're going to use a var list or a local or a global list, you're going to say for each local variable name, the new one that you're going to call in your loop, and then var list or global or local, and then whatever it's called. So that's the first type of for loop. It's called the for each. If you're using a var list, you need to have of. Now the second type of for each loop is you can use any list at all. So for example, if I want to use those same variables, but I don't want to call it a variable list, I'm going to use the word in. So again, this is my local variable name, my local macro name for this loop. It's called X. And then the list of things it's going to loop over are price, miles per gallon, weight, or trunk. So I'm going to go ahead and run it like this. And you can see that I haven't yet made these z variables, so I need to go back and rerun that first loop. So I'll go ahead and do that, and you can see now that I'm summing both the original variable and the standardized variable for price, miles per gallon, weight, and trunk. Now what's really nice about this in is that you can use any list. The list doesn't have to be variables, doesn't have to be numbers, it can also be strings. So for example, let's do another loop where I call my local macro brand, and I'm going to call Chevy, AMC, and Dodge. So this is now a list of strings. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have Stata tell me what brand I'm talking about. This is really useful for debugging. So if I go through and look at my loop, it's sort of easy to see which part of the loop I'm having trouble with. And then I'm going to do a sum if this regular expression, which I'll talk about in a separate video. So basically all I'm asking is in this make variable, look for this brand word somewhere in there. So I'll go ahead and do that. And you can see that what it's doing is it's going through the make variable. It's pulling out cars that have either AMC, Dodge, or Chev in the name somewhere. And it's going ahead and summing the different variables for those specific observations. So that's really the end of for each specifically. So if you've got any questions or something doesn't make sense, leave a comment below. But let's go ahead and move on to Forvalues. So just for Forvalues, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this make variable into each of its words, and I'm going to call each of those words a different brand variable. So brand 1 is the first word, brand 2 is the second word, brand 3 is the third word. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to say for values, I'm going to do a local, which I generally call I. It's going to go from 1 to 3, and it's going to count by 1, so it's going to go 1, 2, or 3. And I'm just going to describe the brand variable, and you can see that I'm describing brand 1, brand 2, and brand 3. This is really useful if you've got, for example, maybe years and you want to loop over a bunch of different years. This is really nice. If you want to do every other year, you could count by 2 instead of 1. Every third year, you could count by 3, and so on. Now, one thing that I want to point out is this only works if your interval is even, so I'm always counting by 1, or I'm always counting by 2, or I'm always counting by 3. If you're doing something like an uneven interval, for example, I've got a bunch of percentiles. Obviously, those percentiles are not evenly spaced across an interval. So what I'm going to do is instead I'm going to use a for each. I'm going to call my local macro cutoff. And then I'm just going to list off all the different values that I want. And then I'm going to use that as my for each loop rather than a for values loop. The other thing that I want to point out with this last little loop here is some of these display commands are really useful for debugging. So for example, I'm going to have Stata tell me what the cutoff is. Then I'm going to have this quiet sum. Then I'm going to sum the price if the price is less than that cutoff. And then this is just a spacer, so it sort of separates the output. So when I run all of this together, what I'm going to see is it's sort of nice that these lines, these dotted lines, basically separate each different version of the loop. And so it's really easy for me to tell what goes with what in terms of the output. And so I can just sort of scroll through and see that everything makes sense. And you can see that my observations are getting higher and higher because my cutoff is getting less and less stringent. So this is just a very basic intro to loops. You can imagine you can do a lot of different complicated things with loops. But if you've got any questions or particular situation you can't figure out, leave a comment below. Or if this was helpful, leave a comment below as well. And again, if you're finding these Stata videos or any of my other videos generally helpful, if you haven't done so, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time for another case of econ struggles.